To each what she can grab. The third plan, that of letting everyone have what she can lay her hands on, would produce a world in which there would be no peace and no security. If we were all equally strong and cunning, we should all have an equal chance. But in a world where there are children and old people and invalids, and where able bodied adults of the same age and strength vary greatly in greediness and wickedness, it would never do. We should get tired of it in no time. Even pirate crews and bands of robbers prefer a peaceful settled understanding as to the division of their plunder to the Kilkenny cat plan. Among ourselves, though robbery and violence are forbidden, we still allow business to be conducted on the principle of letting everybody make what he can out of it without considering anyone but himself. A shopkeeper or a coal merchant may not pick your pocket, but he may overcharge you as much as he likes. Everyone is free in business to get as much and give as little for his money as he can induce his customers to put up with. House rent can be raised without any regard to the cost of the houses or the poverty of the tenant. But this freedom produces such bad results that new laws are continually being made to restrain it. And even when it is a necessary part of our freedom to spend our money and use our possessions as seems best to us, we still have to settle how much money and what possessions we should be given to start with. This distribution must be made according to some law or other. Anarchy, absence of law, will not work. We must go on with our search for a righteous and practicable law. Oligarchy, 과두제. The fourth plan is to take one person in every 10, say, and make her rich without working by making the other 9 work hard and long every day, giving them only enough of what they make to keep them alive and enable them to bring up families to continue their slavery when they grow old and die. This is roughly what happens at present, as 1/10 of the English people own 9/10 of all the property in the country, whilst most of the other 9/10 have no property and live from week to week on wages barely sufficient to support them in a very poor way. The advantage claimed for this plan is that it provides us with a gentry, that is, with a class of rich people able to cultivate themselves by an expensive education, so that they become qualified to govern the country and make and maintain its laws, to organize an officer, the army for national defense, to patronize and keep alive learning, science, art, literature, philosophy, religion, and all the institutions that distinguish great civilizations from mere groups of villages, to raise magnificent buildings, dress splendidly, impose awe on the unruly, and set an example of good manners and fine living. Most important of all, as men of business think, by giving them much more than they need to spend, we enable them to save those great sums of spare money that are called capital and are spent in making railways, mines, factories full of machinery, and all other contrivances by which wealth is produced in great quantities. This plan, which is called oligarchy, is the old English plan of dividing us into gentry living by property and common people living by work. The plan of the few rich and the many poor. It has worked for a long time and is still working, and it is evident that worked that if the incomes of the rich were taken from them and divided among the poor as we stand at present, the poor would be only very little less poor. The supply of capital would cease because nobody could afford to save. The country houses would fall into ruins, and learning and science and art and literature and all the rest of what we call culture would perish. That is why so many people support the present system and stand by the gentry, although they themselves are poor. They see that if 10 women can produce only 110 pounds a year each by their labor, it may be wiser for 9 of them to be content with 50 pounds apiece and make the other one uneducated lady mistress and ruler by giving her 540 pounds a year without any obligation to work at all. Huh? Or any inducement to work except the hope of finding how to make their work more fruitful for her own benefit, rather than to insist on having 110 pounds a year each. Though we make this sort of arrangement at present because we are forced to, and indeed mostly without knowing that we are making it, yet it is conceivable that if we understood what we were doing and were free to carry it out, or not as we thought best, we might still do it for the sake of having a gentry, to keep up finer things in the world than a miserable crowd, all equally poor, and all tied to primitive manual labor. But the abuses that arise from this plan are so terrible that the world is becoming set against it. If we decide to go on with it, the first step is to settle who is to be the 10th person, the lady. How is that to be decided? True, we could begin by drawing lots, and after that, the gentry would intermarry and be succeeded by their firstborns. But the mischief of it is that when we at last got our gentry established, we should have no guarantee that they would do any of the things we intended them to do and pay them to do. With the best intentions, the gentry govern the country very badly because they are so far removed from the common people that they do not understand their needs. They use their power to make themselves still richer by forcing the common people to work still harder and accept still less. They spend enormous sums on sport and entertainment, gluttony and ostentation, and very little on science and art and learning. They produce poverty on a vast scale by withdrawing labor from production to waste it in superfluous menial service. They either shirk military duties or turn the army into a fashionable retinue for themselves and an instrument of operation at home and conquest abroad. They corrupt the teaching in the universities and schools to glorify themselves and hide their misdeeds. They do the same with the church. They try to keep the common people poor and ignorant and servile so as to make themselves more indispensable. At last, their duties have to be taken out of their hands and discharged by Parliament, by the civil service, by the War Office, and the Admiralty, Ad, Admiralty, Admiralty, by city corporations, by poor law guardians, by county and parish and district councils, by salaried servants and board of paid directors, by societies and institutions of all kinds, depending on taxation or on public subscription. When this occurs, as it actually has occurred, all the cultural and political reasons for the maintenance of a gentry vanish. It always does occur when city life grows up and takes the place of country life. When a peeress resides on her estates in a part of the country where life is still very simple, and the nearest thing to a town is a village 10 miles from the railway station, the people look to her ladyship for everything that is not produced by their daily toil. She represents all the splendor and greatness and romance of civilization, and does a good deal for them which they would not know how to do for themselves. In this way, a Highland clan, before Scotland became civilized, always had a chief. The clansmen willingly gave him the lion's share of such land and goods as they could come by, or of the plunder they took in their raids. They did they did this because they could not fight successfully without a leader and could not live together without a lawgiver. Their chief was to them what Moses was to the Israelites in the desert. And Highland chief was practically a king in his clan, just as the peeress is a queen over estates. Loyalty to him was instinctive. But when a Highland chief walked into a city, he had less power than the first police constable he met. In fact, it sometimes happened that the police constable took him in charge, and the city authorities hanged him. When the peeress leaves her estate and goes up to London for the season, she becomes a nobody except to her personal acquaintances. Everything that she does for her people in the country is done in London by paid public servants of all sorts. And when she leaves the country and settles in America or on the continent to evade British income tax, she is not missed in London. Everything goes on just as before, but her tenants, who have to earn the money she spends abroad, get nothing by her and revile her as a fugitive and an absentee. Small wonder, then, that oligarchy is no longer consented to willingly. A great deal of the money the oligarchy get is now taken back from them by taxation and death duties, so that the old families are being reduced very rapidly to the level of ordinary citizens. And when their estates are gone, as they will be after a few generations more of our present heavy death duties, their titles will only make their poverty ridiculous. Already, many of their most famous country houses are occupied either by rich business families of quite ordinary quality or by cooperative societies as convalescent homes or places for conference and recreation, or as hotels or schools or lunatic asylums. You must therefore face the fact that in a civilization like ours, where most of the population lives in cities, where railways, motor cars, post telegraphs, telephones, gramophones, and radio have brought city ways and city culture into the country, and where even the smallest village has its parish meeting and its communal policeman, the old reasons for making a few people very rich, whilst all the others work hard for a bare subsistence, have passed away. The plan no longer works, even in the highlands. Still, there is one reason left for maintaining a class of excessively rich people at the expense of the rest, and businessmen consider it the strongest reason of all. That reason is that it provides capital by giving some people more money than they can easily spend, so that they can save money. Capital is saved money without any privation. The argument is that if income were more equally distributed, we should all have so little that we should spend all our incomes, and nothing would be saved to make machinery and build factories and construct railways and dig mines and so forth. Now it is certainly necessary to high civilization that these savings should be made, but it would be hard to imagine a more wasteful way of bringing it about. To begin with, it is very important that there should be no saving until there has been sufficient spending. Spending comes first. A nation makes steam engines before its little children have enough milk to make their legs strong enough to carry them. Is making a fool's choice. Yet this is just what we do by this plan of making a few rich and the masses poor. Again, even if we put the steam engine before the milk, our plan gives us no security that we shall get the steam engine, or if we get it, that it'll be set up in our country. Just as a great deal of the money that was given to the country gentlemen of England on the chance of their encouraging art and science was spent by them on cockfighting and horse racing. So shocking proportion of the money we give our oligarchs on the chance of their investing it as capital is spent by them in self-indulgence. Of the very rich, it may be said that they do not begin to save until they can spend no more, and that they are continually investing new and expensive extravagances that would have been impossible 100 years ago. When their income outruns their extravagances so far that they must use it as capital or throw it away, There's nothing to prevent them investing it in South America, in South Africa, in Russia, or in China, though we cannot get our own slums cleaned up for want of capital kept in and applied to our own country. Hundreds of millions of pounds are sent abroad every year in this way, and we complain of the competition of foreigners, whilst we allow our capitalists to provide them at our expense with the very machinery with which they are taking our industries from us. Of course, the capitalists plead that we are none the poorer because the interest on their capital comes back into this country from the countries in which they have invested it, and as they invested abroad only because they get more interest abroad than at home. They assure us that we are actually the richer for their export of capital because it enables them to spend more at home and thus give British workers more employment. But we have no guarantee that they will spend it at home. They are as likely to spend it in Monte Carlo, Madeira, Egypt, or where not. And when they do spend it at home and give us employment, we have to ask what sort of employment. When our farms and mills and cloth factories are all ruined by our importing our food and cloth from abroad instead of making them ourselves, it is not enough for our capitalists to show us that instead of the farms we have the best golf courses in the world. Instead of mills and factories, splendid hotels. Instead of engineers and shipwrights and bakers and carpenters and weavers, waiters and chambermaids, valets and ladies' maids, gamekeepers and butlers and so forth, all better paid and more elegantly dressed than the productive workers they have replaced. We have to consider what sort of position we shall be in when our workers are as incapable of supporting themselves and us as the idle rich themselves. Suppose the foreign countries stop our supplies either by a revolution followed by flat repudiation of their capitalistic debts, as in Russia, or by taxing and super taxing incomes derived from investments. What will become of us then? What is becoming of us now as taxation of income spreads more and more in foreign countries? The English servant may still be able to boast that England can put a more brilliant polish on a multi-millionaire's boots than any foreigner can. But what use will that be to us when the multimillionaire is an expropriated or taxed out pauper with no boots to have polished? We shall have to go into this question of capital more particularly later on, but for the purposes of this chapter, it is enough to show that the plan of depending on oligarchy for our national capital is not only wasteful on the face of it, but dangerous with a danger that increases with every political development in the world. The only plea left for it is that there is no other way of doing it, but that will not hold water for a moment. The government can and to a considerable extent actually does, check personal expenditure and enforce the use of part of our incomes as capital, far less capriciously and more efficiently than our oligarchy does. It can nationalize banking, as we shall see presently. This leaves oligarchy without its sole economic excuse. Distribution by class. Now for the fifth plan, which is that though everybody should work, society should be divided into as many classes as there are different sorts of work, and that the different classes should receive this different payment for their work. For instance, the dustmen and scavengers and scullery maids and charwomen and rag pickers should receive less than the doctors and clergymen and teachers and opera singers and professional ladies generally, and that these should receive less than the judges and prime ministers and kings and queens. You'll tell me that this is just what we have at present. Certainly it happens so in many cases, but there is no law that people employed in different sorts of work should be paid more or less than one another. We are accustomed to think that school mistresses and clergymen and doctors, being educated ladies and gentlemen, must be paid more than illiterate persons who work with their hands for weekly wages. But at the present time, an engine driver making no pretension to be a gentleman or to have had a college education is paid more than many clergymen and some doctors. And a schoolmistress or governess is very lucky indeed when she is as well off as a far first-rate cook. Some of our most famous physicians have had to struggle pitiably against insufficient means until they were 40 or 50, and many a parson has brought up a family on a stipend of £70 a year. You must therefore be on your guard against the common mistake of supposing that we need nowadays pay more for gentility and education than for bodily strength and natural cunning, or that we always do pay more. Very learned men often make little money or none, and gentility without property may prove rather a disadvantage than otherwise to a man who wants to earn a living. Most of the great fortunes are made in trade or finance, often by men without any advantages of birth or education. Some of the great poverties have been those of saints or of geniuses whose greatness was not recognized until they were dead. You must also get rid of the notion, if you have it, if not, forgive me for suspecting you of it, that it costs some workers more than others to live. The same allowance of food that will keep a laborer in health will keep a king. Many laborers eat and drink much more than the king does, and all of them wear out their clothes much faster. Our king is not rich as riches go nowadays. Mr. Rockefeller probably regards His Majesty as a poor man because Mr. Rockefeller not only has much more money but is under no obligation to spend it in keeping up a great establishment. That is, spending it on other people. But if you could find out how much the king and Mr. Rockefeller spend on their own personal needs and satisfaction, you'll find it came to no more than is now spent by any other two persons in reasonably comfortable circumstances. If you double the king's allowance, he would not eat twice as much, drink twice as much, sleep twice as soundly, build a new house twice as big as Buckingham Palace, or marry another queen, and set up two families instead of one. The late Mr. Carnegie, when his thousands grew to hundreds of thousands and his hundreds of thousands to millions, gave his money away in heaps because he already had everything he cared for that money could buy for himself or his household. Then it may be asked, why do we give some men more than they need and some less? The answer is that for the most part we do not give it to them. They get it because we have not arranged what anyone shall get, but have left it to chance and grab. But in the case of the king and other public dignitaries, we have arranged that they shall have handsome incomes because we intend that they shall be specially respected and deferred to. Yet experience shows that authority is not proportionate to income. No person in Europe is approached with such awe as the Pope, but nobody thinks of the Pope as a rich man. Sometimes his parents and brothers and sisters are very humble people, and he himself is poorer than his tailor or grocer. The captain of a liner sits at table every day with scores of people who could afford to throw his pay into the sea and not miss it. Yet his authority is so absolute that the most insolent passenger dares not treat him disrespectfully. The village rector may not have a fifth of the income of his former churchwarden. The colonel of a regiment may be the poorest man at the mess table. Every one of his subalterns may have far more than double his income, but he is their superior in authority for all that. Money is not the secret of command. Those who exercise personal authority among us are by no means our richest people. Millionaires in expensive cars obey policemen. In our social scale, noblemen take precedence of country gentlemen. Country gentlemen take precedence of professional men, professional men of traders, wholesale traders of retail traders of skilled workmen, and skilled workmen of laborers. But if social precedence were according to income, all this would be completely upset. For the tradesman would take precedence of everybody, and the Pope and the King would have to touch their hats to distillers and pork packers. When we speak of the power of the rich, we are speaking of a very real thing, because a rich man can discharge anyone in his employment who displeases him, and can take away his custom from any tradesman who is disrespectful to him. But the advantage a man gets by his power to ruin another is a quite different thing from the authority that is necessary to maintain law and order in society. You may obey the highwayman who puts a pistol to your head and demands your money or your life. Similarly, you may obey the landlord who orders you to pay more rent or take yourself and your brats into the streets. But that is not obedience to authority. It is submission to a threat. Real authority has nothing to do with money, and it is in fact exercised by persons who, from the king to the village constable, are poorer than many of the people who obey their orders. Laissez-faire, 자유방임주의. And now, what about leaving things just as they are? That is just what most people vote for doing, even when they don't like what they are accustomed to. They dread change, lest it should make matters worse. They are what they call conservative, though it is only fair to add that no conservative statesman in his senses ever pretends, except perhaps occasionally at election times when nobody ever tells the truth, that you can conserve things by simply letting them alone. It seems the easiest plan and the safest. But as a matter of hard fact, it is not only difficult but impossible. When Joshua told the sun to stand still on Gibeon, and the moon in the valley of Ajalon, for a trifle of 24 hours, he was modest in comparison with those who imagine that the world will stay put if they take care not to wake it up, and he knew he was asking for a miracle. It is not that things as they are so bad that nobody who knows how bad they are will agree to leave them as they are. For the reply to that may be that if they don't like them, they must lump them, because there seems to be no way of changing them. The real difficulty is that things will not stay as they are, no matter how careful you are not to meddle with them. You might as well give up dusting your rooms and expect to find them this time next year just as they are now. You might as well leave the cat asleep on the hearthrug and assume that you would find her there and not in the dairy when you came back from church. The truth is that things change much faster and more dangerously when they are let alone than when they are carefully looked after. Within the last 150 years, the most astounding changes have taken place in this very business that we are dealing with, the production and distribution of the national income. Just because what was everybody's business was nobody's business, and it was let run wild. The introduction of machinery driven by steam, and later on of electric power distributed from house to house like water or gas, and the invention of engines that not only drove trains along the ground and ships over and under the sea, but carry us and our goods flying through the air, has increased our power to produce wealth and get through our work easily and quickly to such an extent that there is no longer any need for any of us to be poor. A labor-saving house with gas stoves, electric light, a telephone, a vacuum cleaner, and a wireless set gives only a faint notion of a modern factory full of automatic machines. If we each took our turn and did our bit in peace, as we had to do during the war, all the necessary feeding and clothing and housing and lighting could be done handsomely by less than half our present day's work, leaving the other half free for art and science and learning and playing and roaming and experimenting and recreation of all sorts. This is a new state of thing, a change that has come upon us when we thought we were leaving things just as they were. And the consequence of our not attending to it and guiding and arranging it for the good of the country is that it has actually left the poor much worse off than they used to be when there was no machinery at all, and people had to be more careful of pence than they now are of shillings. Whilst the rich have become rich out of all reason, and the people who should be employed in making bread for the hungry and clothes for the naked, or building houses for the homeless, or wasting their labor in providing service and luxuries for idle rich people who are not in the old sense of the words, either gentle or noble, and whose idleness and frivolity and extravagance set a most corrupting moral example. Also, it has produced the two and a half revolutions in political power by which the employers have overthrown the landed gentry. The financiers have overthrown the employers, and the trade unions have half overthrown the financiers. I shall explain this fully later on. Meanwhile, you have seen enough of its effects in the rise of the Labour Party to take my word for it that politics will not stand still any more than industry merely because millions of timid, old fashioned people vote at every election for what they call conservatism. That is, for shutting our eyes and opening our mouths. If King Alfred had been told that the time would come in England when one idle family would have 5 big houses and a steam yacht to live in, whilst the hard-working people were living 6 in a room and half starving at that, he would have said that God would never allow such things to happen except in a very wicked nation. Where we have left God out of the question and allowed it to happen, not through wickedness, but through letting things alone and fancying that they would let themselves alone. Have you noticed, by the way, that we no longer speak of letting things alone in the old-fashioned way? We speak of letting them slide, and this is a great advance in good sense, for it shows that we at last see that they slide instead of staying put, and it implies that letting them slide is a feckless sort of conduct. So you must rule out once for all the notion of leaving things as they are in the expectation that they will stay where they are. They won't. All we can do in that line is to sit idly and wonder what will happen next. And this is not like sitting on the bank of the stream waiting for the water to go by. It is like sitting idly in a carriage when the horse is running away. You can excuse it by saying, "What else can I do?" But your importance will not avert a smash. People in that predicament must all think hard of any way of getting control of the horse, and meanwhile do all they can to keep the carriage right side up and out of the ditch. The policy of letting things alone, in the practical sense that the government should never interfere with business or go into business itself, is called laissez-faire by economists and politicians. It has broken down so completely in practice that it is now discredited. But it was all the fashion in politics 100 years ago, and is still influentially advocated by men of business and their backers, who naturally would like to be allowed to make money as they please without regard to the interests of the public.